Right. Once again, a bit late, but hopefully not to the point where it is of no to us at all. I want just to say a few things about utilitarianism as a theory, what motivates the argument, how to think of it, I think, in a way that makes it the most plausible or powerful theory it can be. This, I have to confess, is a small interest. I won't quite say obsession of mine, but something like that. I feel certainly this was my experience as an undergraduate. It's a very natural feature of undergraduate philosophy, undergraduate moral philosophy, to see utilitarianism as a kind of not quite whipping boy, but as a theory whose unsatisfactoriness is kind of woven into it from the start. And a theory that we show our competence with respect to essentially by rehearsing its flaws and limitations and the reasons why it cannot possibly be a satisfactory theory. I think this is most people's experience with their exposure to the theory. And I have to say, funnily enough, part of the consequence of having studied moral theory with Rawls when I was a graduate student was almost the opposite. Rawls, of course, as some of you know, develops an extremely powerful counter to utilitarian theory in his own theory of justice, which we will look at the end of the course. But it was very important to Rawls to characterize utilitarianism in the most persuasive way possible. And the typical kinds of criticisms and inconsistencies that were usually made of the theory were, I won't quite say airbrushed away or agree with him that many of these so-called difficulties really can be met if we rephrase the theory in more charitable, more plausible ways. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to try and present a version of utilitarianism that is, I think, better, more impressive than is usually presented as being the case. I'm not a utilitarian. But I do think utilitarianism is typically, characteristically misrepresented in undergraduate education and graduate education in the American liberal arts. And there's one man who can stand up and correct it, and that is me. Well, not quite, but in any event, that is kind of the orientation. So I will be giving a kind of motivation for the theory, a kind of account of why I think the theory is powerful, plausible, impressive, whatever you want. And I will be trying at every turn to give a characterization of the theory that makes it look better rather than worse. All right, with that in mind, let's do it. Okay, I think utilitarianism is driven by the following intuitions. There's first the idea that there exists, before we start doing moral philosophy or social philosophy, some notion of the good that we can make sense of, antecedent to moralizing. This is the idea of our own happiness or satisfaction, or our plans becoming realized on one hand, or conversely, when we are frustrated, subject to discomfort or pain, the ways in which these things are very much not good for us. And so the utilitarian annexes, I think, a kind of plausible pre-moral philosophical idea of the good, that of benefit. We find, our health a good. We find illness a bad, an ill, an evil. We find realizing our desires a benefit. We find their frustration the contrary. There's a kind of pre-moral normative world here that we're already acquainted with. that's very much in the background that utilitarianism will take up, annex, and then use as part of its what's the word I want? Sort of the raw material, the bricks and mortar for what then becomes the moral theory. And this pre-moral world, again, is just the world of benefit. It's a world that we can extend, if you will, even to animals and creatures. They are obviously better off when they're not injured. They're worse off when they are. There's also a point here about offering an account of value that is going to do justice to the tremendous variety of the particular objects that different people will understandably take up and pursue. So you may wish to travel around Italy and see the Quattrocento paintings, and I may want to go to Colorado and ski, and someone else may want to raise a family, and someone else may want to go study butterflies in Guatemala. In each case, the objects are, of course, wildly diverse. But it's plausible to say that when we get what we want, whatever that object is, something quite similar happens to all of us. We get the satisfaction of realizing our desire. The objects may be different, but the idea of satisfaction, realizing our desires, the benefit, the good of that happening or being the case, this is a kind of solvent, a kind of universal lingua franca we can apply to persons regardless of how much they otherwise differ. All right, that's one intuition, that having our desires satisfied is a good thing. Having them frustrated is a bad one. Being free from injury and in good health is a good thing. The opposite is not. So we have these ideas of the good that we can make sense of as true of persons, regardless of how much they otherwise differ. And this pre-moral fact has a great deal of currency, a great deal of weight in the moral theory Mill is then going to develop. The other extremely powerful intuition, and I mentioned this before, is egalitarianism. Mill takes it as simply undeniable that no other assumption is a plausible, stable assumption at this point in our history. I think he's very good about this. He says, yeah, well, sure. People have presumed that perhaps the happiness of the king counts in a way that the happiness of the serf does not. People have assumed that, we need only worry about the master, not about the slave. But at this point in our history, we can't possibly imagine any understanding that could serve as a stable principle of cooperation between persons than that of egalitarianism. And this is an extremely important point, often overlooked. Utilitarianism offers itself as a reasonable theory of social cooperation. And one of the reasons it can do so is it can say to its audience, as Mill does, look, everyone will be counted equally. No one is left out. This is the understanding that is reasonably offered as a reasonable grounds of social cooperation. We want some mechanism by which we adjudicate our conflicts, some means by which we can go forward and figure out what the right thing to do might be. Well, no principle has a chance of being stable, of being one we could as a population endorse, unless it guaranteed or offered egalitarian consideration. Everyone must be counted, and everyone must be counted equally. In this sense, utilitarianism is deeply reformist, given that we inevitably, at any point in history, are not counting everyone equally. There will be divisions in status. There will be divisions in gender. There will be divisions in race. And it is not the case that everyone is counted equally. The utilitarian is saying, That's no good. That's not how it should be. We must try as far as we can to have a social arrangement, to be on a social footing in which everyone is, to use Bentham's famous phrase, each to count as one, no one to count as more than one. So you combine these two kind of pre-moral intuitions, the egalitarianism, everyone in any plausible social arrangement at this stage in our history is to be counted equally, and there is some idea of the good, utility, disutility that we can make sense of, that's abstract, that's impersonal, that we can employ, that will fit easily over the wildly diverse objects of interest that different persons have. Et voila, as we might say. All right, then. What then is the right thing to do, the right way to go forward, the right way to arrange things? Well, given that all must be counted equally, and we have this idea of the good, which is sufficiently abstract and sufficiently impersonal as to accommodate the wildly diverse nature of persons, whatever it is they happen to want, the outcome is the right thing to do is exactly the utilitarian motto: promote the greatest utility for the greatest number. Now, you notice it's a small point, but it may come up. We'll see from time to time. I prefer to say the greatest utility, not the greatest pleasure, although that's Mill's term. And Mill thinks of pleasure as essentially synonymous with utility. For obvious reasons, I think the theory is stronger if we use the term utility, and so far as possible, push the idea where we can to a more objective rather than subjective understanding. It's not, for example, the pleasure that you take in getting that polio vaccination that I'm particularly interested in, or the pleasure you might have in knowing that you've got a much smaller chance of ever contracting polio. No, I don't want to think about it that way. I want to think, look, there's just great utility for the population if we give everybody this polio vaccination, and large numbers of people who would have gotten ill don't get ill. I'd rather talk about it in terms of more rather than less utility, and where possible, speak of benefits and injuries in objective, transpersonal, non-subjective terms. I think the theory is more plausible this way. Another side point, but it will come up when I talk briefly about the two pleasures doctrine. I think utilitarianism, even though Mill thinks of it as an absolutely comprehensive doctrine in which you could reasonably ask how to plan your day by taking up utilitarian matrix and utilitarian considerations, I think the theory is best understood as a theory of social cooperation, a theory of social policy. I don't think it performs best when thought of as a means by which you might decide how to structure your particular projects and life goals and so forth and so on. It really is a theory best designed to accommodate the distinctive project of figuring out the right way to go forward in the context of social cooperation. And that's how I will primarily understand the theory. I think one of the unfortunate things going on in that very early discussion of higher and lower pleasures is just that, where Mill is determined to show that utilitarianism can account for the way in which in our personal lives certain kinds of projects and interests have a kind of status that other pleasures, like, you know, eating a decent meal or having a drink at the end of a hot day, simply cannot compare to. And I think that's quite right. I also tend to think it's not really very relevant to what utilitarianism is trying to do as a theory. I'm bracketing that. I'll come back to that and say a little bit more about the higher and lower pleasures doctrine, only because it's so famous. I don't think, as a matter of fact, it's a terribly important doctrine from the standpoint of assessing utilitarianism as a theory. And because I'm anxious in this video to just get the theory out and say what's really impressive and interesting and formidable about it, and then say something about where it is vulnerable, even when it is understood charitably, I may postpone this higher lower pleasures doctrine issue for another time and for the class. We'll see what kind of interest you have in it. So let me just move on. Okay. So I think that one of the great strengths of utilitarianism is it is undeniably egalitarian. Its egalitarianism bleeds quite naturally into its reformism, given that all are count equally. It's always going to be pressuring us in a good way to ask whether we ought to revise our present practices in ways that really do take others into account more adequately, more satisfactorily. Utilitarians in the 19th century were understandably very interested in, say, women's suffrage, with ending the slave trade. These things were going on, and the utilitarians were very clear. This is not the way to promote the greatest utility for the greatest number, to have these arrangements. And so utilitarianism will always have a certain kind of, how can I put it, impressive, casual lack of deference to custom or the past. It's sort of like if you inherit a portfolio from your grandparents and, they've bought all these municipal bonds and you say, yeah, okay, that's what they did. But I got to ask, what are the investments that'll produce the best yield? I can't really be terribly gripped or deferential towards how, they did it 20 years ago. I got to ask, what's the best way to do it now? And that's how the utilitarian is going to see the practices and policies of a culture. What could we do to change things to make them more productive, conducive to a good utilitarian outcome? This is why, of course, Singer is so aggressive about changing our policies towards animals. And when we read his essay on famine relief, on how we respond to appeals for help for those in need, the utilitarian is going to really take seriously these two background considerations, that what really counts in the end is benefit or utility, as Mill says at one point with just remarkably beautiful, kind of Dickensian tenderness. What really counts is freedom from misery and freedom from pain. And we've got to get our hands dirty and worry about it, and worry about every person who could be made better by an alteration of our policies. So you have this idea of the good, which easily fits onto anybody's circumstances. And you have this deep, undeniably aggressive commitment to egalitarianism. And then between the two, you're going to be very, very reformist where necessary. You're going to be looking, as we might, at that investment portfolio and wondering whether there are other ways of arranging things that would produce greater utility for the relevant population. So I want you to have that in mind. It's egalitarian. It's employing an extremely flexible and in some ways non-controversial notion of the good. I mean, it's a notion that, of course, also allows it to extend consideration to animals. When we look at these more glamorous views like Kant and Aristotle's, which have this picture of persons as, in Kant's case, this very almost mystical, rational agent able to take up its desires when those desires have generated a command of means and rationality with a certain sort of autonomy. And in Aristotle's case, persons will be understood as having this kind of distinctive and very impressive teleology. All of that don't get nervous. All of that will become clear in time. But with utilitarianism, it's precisely the absence of glamour in the underlying view that makes it so powerful and impressive. What are persons? They're creatures that can feel pleasure and pain. That's what we are. all the other stuff about us, our sublimity, our ability to write poetry and fall in love, that might have a lot of importance for Mill when he's talking about the higher pleasures. But when we're talking about how to produce the greatest utility for the greatest number, we're thinking of persons as creatures capable of satisfaction or frustration. And it's a conception that easily extends even to animals or creatures without the ability for, complicated social relations to one another, without language and so forth. Cows may not be able to, form social policy and wonder about college admissions, but they do suffer. And we must extend our worry about suffering to any creature that is capable of it. So there is this marvelous power that comes with relying upon a really non-controversial and fairly simple, even primitive conception of, quote, what counts. What counts is our capacity for pleasure and pain, our capacity to have more or less benefit or utility in our lives. That, coupled with the determination to count every person in the relevant population. I mean, there's a sense in which when we're making laws in England, we worry about the people here in England. We're not worrying about the people in San Francisco. We're going to worry about the relevant population. Each member really will count equally for good utilitarians. So, as I say, this, I think, makes the theory very powerful. It is, for Rawls, rightly, the one to beat. It's, when we get to Rawls and we take up his veil of ignorance and we're choosing principles that would guide us in a just society, utilitarianism comes in number two. His two principles come in number one. But there's no question this is a very, very plausible approach to the problem of social coordination and social cooperation. So I wanted to stress that. Okay. Obviously, this came up in my email, and some of you have had intro courses in which utilitarianism has been taken up, and this problem has come up there. I'll just mention it. I don't want to say too much about it in this video talk because I want you to have a chance to read Rawls's two concepts of rules. But the problem is, in a way, lurking behind the very charitable and, I hope, plausible account of utilitarianism that I've just rehearsed. You might say, well, look, if what we're really, 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 really interested in is producing the greatest utility for the relevant population, then clearly anything that stands in the way of doing that really ought to be set aside. Since that is the final, ultimate goal of social cooperation, of moral theory, we ought not to be, constrained by any understandings that would prevent us from reaching this outcome. And you might even see this as the kind of underside of the reformist point. And you might think, some certainly have thought, that our intuition that people as persons have certain rights against certain sorts of treatment by the state to be exactly the sort of constraint that the utilitarian, if he's going to be pure and wholly committed, ought to brush aside. And there are many examples of this, what I've called rights criticism, because the idea is essentially this: aren't rights, and to the extent we can make sense of them in some kind of rough and ready intuitive way, obstacles to producing utility under certain circumstances? And when they are, isn't the good utilitarian committed to brushing them aside, abrogating them, not being so constrained? The example I rehearsed in the email, very familiar. You might call it the involuntary organ donor transplant case. You might say, imagine a fact pattern where there's a healthy visitor to a doctor's office, just going there to get his blood pressure checked. And in the next room are 6 not so healthy people, each one of which needs a particular organ, a kidney, a lung, a stomach, whatever, a pancreas, whatever, a heart. And it so happens that this healthy visitor has the organs that, were they harvested, would make these 6 live. And again, this is always put forward as a criticism. It's not as if this is something the utilitarian typically endorses. Doesn't it seem, in a hypothetical, highly artificial, imagined fairy tale like this, that the utilitarian nevertheless would be committed to harvesting these organs against, no doubt, the desires of the visitor, distributing them, and thereby, while certainly losing 1 life, saving 6? And let's remember, from a utilitarian point of view, does the death of the innocent visitor count? Of course it does. Does it count equally to anyone else's? Of course it does. But the death of 1 against the life of 6, it seems undeniable that you ought, if you really ought to promote the greatest utility for the greatest number, sacrifice this 1 for these 6. Now, obviously, if this 1 were a saint, a utilitarian saint, we might have no issue. Somebody might say, oh my God, I can, by giving up my life, save 6. Let me sign the consent form. But that's not the case we have in mind. The criticism of the theory goes, the utilitarian must brush aside what we might think of as this person's, in this case, right to his body. We typically think, well, I have a right to my body regardless of how much utility you might be able to extract by violating that right. There are many such cases like this, where to respect a person's right is to, in a certain sense, be indifferent to the utility that you might gain were you to violate it. There are imperfect but powerful examples in our criminal procedure commitment. So if someone has a right not to be coerced into a confession, if someone has a right not to be, bullied when arrested, then he has that right, or she has that right, even if doing so might lead the police to the presence of somebody who is, presently locked up somewhere and suffering, or some other fact pattern that you wish to tell. Inevitably, the justifications for abrogating rights will point to the benefits of doing so. And the utilitarian would seem to be on the wrong side of that issue. The utilitarian would seem to be committed in advance to saying, why would we even have this idea of rights in the first place if that means something that would stop us from doing what we would otherwise do to produce the greatest utility for the greatest number? I mean, it's fine to use this talk so long as you don't get it into your head that this is a kind of constraint, that this will stop you from doing what utilitarianism requires. Now, if this is so, utilitarianism seems to be almost dead in the water before it begins. In other words, if utilitarianism doesn't have a good answer to that involuntary organ donor transplant case, it would seem to be a deeply unsatisfactory theory from the start. I think this came up in the last class when the students brought this out as a problem of what he called justice and utility. Justice is a somewhat more broad-based term. In the chapter Justice and Utility and Utilitarianism, Mill talks about lots of things like keeping a promise or respecting property rules and things like this. And I think that's entirely right. The word justice has a very extensive application in all kinds of domains. It might focus things a bit better if we were to just call this the rights criticism. And it essentially goes like this: because to speak of rights is to speak of a claim that persons have to a certain treatment or a good, regardless of the benefit that might be extracted from violating that claim. It seems almost impossible for utilitarianism to respect rights, since utilitarianism would seem to be committed to doing whatever it is you can do to produce the greatest benefit available. And that's why the utilitarian seems to be committed to harvesting the organs of that innocent visitor and distributing those organs to the 6 hapless characters in the clinic's waiting room. I think the utilitarian has several levels of answer to that worry. And with luck, this is going to come up in the class that we have on Thursday. I just wanted to introduce it. Rawls takes up this worry in the context of punishment. You can rehearse this worry in a million different contexts. In the punishment context, you just imagine you tell some story in which punishing, if you can still call it that, but inflicting incarceration or pain on an innocent person, given some wild and crazy story you tell, will actually produce benefit. And as a utilitarian, then, aren't you committed to doing just that? That's the subject of Rawls's essay. I don't want to say too much more until you've had a chance to read it. With luck, this will come up on Thursday. Obviously, as you can gather, because I think utilitarianism is a plausible theory, I think there are things the utilitarian can say that quiet that worry. I don't, as a matter of fact, think that as a utilitarian, you can't make sense of rights. But we're going to talk about that more another time. In this video lecture, or whatever it is you want to call it, I simply wanted to rehearse the considerations that make utilitarianism an impressive, plausible theory, and say something about how the rights criticism gets off the ground, gets motivated. And I'll leave it at that. If there's interest, I'll talk about the 2 pleasures doctrine. That would be fine. But I'll be frank with you. I don't expect to ask you a question about this on the midterm or the final. And under the circumstances, when we're in a class, that's kind of no big deal. So what? We have a couple of minutes on something that doesn't appear in the midterm or final. Under our circumstances presently, it may be, given how hard it is to stay on top of the subjects that we will try and show competence in an exam situation with respect to, that we may or may not take up those that will not so appear. But if you read those passages and were interested and puzzled, yeah, let's talk about it. It's certainly, a very famous part of Mill's argument. But I also want to say a bit more about what Mill himself says about justice and utility, and how he understands the alleged conflict and how to reconcile the two. He doesn't quite understand it in its modern or contemporary terms, what I'm calling the rights criticism. This seems to have developed in discussions of utilitarianism after Mill's time upon the philosophical stage. And that raises yet another small point that I just want to make. Utilitarianism is a doctrine that is not exhausted by any one of its practitioners. And if you think about it, you can see it in Mill's utilitarianism. It's very obvious he's responding to objections to the theory that have already been made. Because, there was a very important utilitarian before him, Jeremy Bentham, his teacher, who had a cruder version of utilitarianism than the one Mill wishes to defend. But the point is, it's out there in the public already. It's like talking about socialism or liberalism or a million other doctrines. It's out there. Particular practitioners will offer particular defenses and particular refinements. Rawls himself speaks with some jealousy about this, where he says, it's fantastic. Utilitarianism has been with us now for like 200 years, and it gets refined and improved by responding to the criticisms and so on. Whereas Kantianism, the doctrine he's anxious to defend, really is sort of identified with the particular version of it Kant himself offered. And one of Rawls's great contributions to moral theory was to change that. And so when I say of myself, well, I'm a Kantian, I mean I don't mean I follow what Kant said. There are certain strands in Kant that, yeah, I endorse, but so much of what I'm prepared to endorse has to do with the improvements on the theory that we've seen in the 20th and 21st century following Rawls's great development of the theory. But utilitarianism is kind of on the right track in this way from the start. It's not excessively identified with any particular author. It's a body of doctrines, and these doctrines can be massaged and somewhat altered depending on what version of these doctrines we think do best against criticisms. And this makes it an extremely, flexible and formidable moral theory. Mill's version of utilitarianism is only sometimes the version of utilitarianism that I think is the one we ought to most worry about, the one that I think is most formidable. Mill is great because the sincerity and authenticity of his writing and commitment to equality and progress is just undeniable and vivid and transparent. But obviously, I prefer talk of utility and benefit to talk of pleasure. It's pretty obvious. I don't think the doctrine of higher and pleasures has a central place in any, plausible version of utilitarian theory. And Mill writes before the rights criticism is developed. So he doesn't really have much to say in reply to this very important criticism. I should also say there's a distinction that I'll take up in a subsequent lecture between what gets called act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism. Mill does not seem to be aware of this distinction. I just don't think it's in philosophical life at the time he's writing, and he sometimes writes as if he's defending one, sometimes the other. Totally understandable when the distinction isn't there. Unsurprisingly, I'm going to defend, and I think the only plausible version of utilitarianism that we want to defend is some version of what gets called rule utilitarianism. But all this, I think, can wait for another time. For today, it's enough that you marinate on that earlier point about the conception of value, the egalitarianism, and how the rights criticism arises. And with that, I'm going to say goodbye, and we will see each other on Thursday.